Okay, this is February the 8th, 2022. We're first going to have the trip comment about this picture that has the flag, Black Liberation Front.
Mhm.
And then we will follow that up with a continuation of the interview on Cuba, the interview with Xenia Tripp, our daughter, and Luke Tripp. Over to you, Luke.
Okay. In this picture, you see part of the 84 students who defied the United States travel ban in 1984. In the foreground of the picture are 5 of the 11 Black students who are part of the group. And there is a story behind the showing and the meaning of this flag, the Black Liberation Front. And I will discuss it during the interview by my daughter, Xenia Tripp. Xenia, do you have some questions about this picture and about the meaning of the flag?
Do you want to talk more about the people behind you who was involved in the group?
Oh, the people behind the flag are the others on the second row.
Yeah, but yeah, past the people that are sitting behind you all.
Well, some of the students, well, generally, I'll just do a general description. Most of the, virtually all of the students were what you could consider liberals to militant radicals. So as you can see, most of the majority of the student group were white students from universities and from different regions of the country.
Do you remember from where?
Well, some, they were from California, a lot of from the East Coast and West Coast, mainly from California, from New York, from New Jersey. There were, I can only remember one white person from the South. And, you know, our group, the Yahoo members were from the Midwest, Detroit.
So why do you think you said the in the interview that General Baker did and in your documents you said that there was around 85 college students and you're saying that they're predominantly white. Do you know why that is and why didn't they recruit more of a diverse student body? Not that there isn't diversity within the Caucasian population, it's not homogeneous, but where did you, at least because of the focus was on racialized trauma, why do you think these particular students were brought together and maybe not holding the same narratives that you all, like not making you all the majority in Cuba, which is kind of interesting.
Okay. First, number one, those who organized the trip were white. So it was Black students. We signed up for it. And it was basically the recruitment drive was targeting in a general way students, progressive students are students that were on the left. And
was it like an application process and you had to pay for it? Was this something that was, how were you able to go? Because if you're coming from working class families,
right.
You're saying that this is the first time that you left the country, you're leaving the country on to a place that's banned by the United States. So I'm assuming you don't have like the funds to do that. How were you able to, how were the four of you able to access this opportunity that it seems like we're very life-changing, because this is something that you've talked about within my development, and then also talking to Carol Baker. This is also something that seems to be pretty prolific in your liberation identity.
The trip was entirely free. I mean, the airfare, all of the arrangements, all of the meals while we were in Cuba, on our way to, during, and coming back was completely paid by the Cuban government, and I would, my guess is some progressive white organizations. So it was basically maybe Cuban resources and white radical funds.
And did you all bring that flag from Detroit? And was that the flag that you used within Uhuru? Or can you tell me kind of the symbolism of this flag? Did someone that you knew made it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the story of the flag, I think we didn't take it from Detroit. It was not part of our luggage going to Cuba. And I think that was somebody, I think that was made in Cuba. And I think Charles Simmons probably know the name because I don't know who.
So someone might have gifted it to you. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, because, I think this was made in
Do you
Cuba.
remember?
No, I didn't. I at that
So you
time,
just took a picture with a
uh,
flag. You're like, this is a great present. I love
yeah,
presents.
right. So what was happening is, see, the Black Liberation Front, we were just part of liberation fronts. There was the Vietnamese Liberation Front. There was the African Liberation Front. There's the Latin American Liberation Front. There's Puerto Rican Liberation Front. So all of the students who were at the forefront of the struggle in their locations, in their countries, and since we were in a struggle, some in active struggle, like in the Vietnamese, they were at the cutting edge of a liberation front, And so all of those, if you were in struggle, regardless of where you were, there was a common identity of struggling against imperialism, struggling against racism, struggling against capitalism. So those were the three targets. So if you're in the forefront and if you are active and militant, then you label yourself a liberation front.
So, you had mentioned that different communities had their liberation flag. You said that you all had the Black liberation flag, and there was also an African liberation flag. Can you explain the difference during that time period of what those differences were? Because you said now that they're separate flags, and also you as descendants of enslaved people from North America. And then if you're also having this African population, so what did Black liberation mean in the 60s, or like when you're holding that flag? Can you tell me like the contrasting and similarities between both of those flags?
Okay, first of all, on the continent of Africa, different African groups had basically flags that symbolize their nation. They're building in struggling against colonialism and founding their own nations. You can't see it in this picture, but if it were in color, it'd be red, black, and green. And that
Which is the
color,
Pan-African colors,
yeah,
right?
it was right,
Mhm.
Pan-African colors, right? And so, yeah, it's Pan-Africanism.
But then people are holding their regional flags, but then you as a collective are holding this Black liberation flag.
Well, yeah, but the colors are red, black, and green.
Mhm.
Okay. And so this is how we identify. And that's one of the reasons why we were in Cuba, connecting with all of the other insurgency liberation groups around the globe.
So can you tell me the difference of like what Black liberation meant for you all in the early 60s? And then what does it mean for you today? And has it metamorphosized at all?
Yes. Well, all of us didn't have exactly the same ideology, but all of us were essentially we united against capitalism, and we were all pro-socialist, anti-capitalist, pro-socialist. And then in terms of our vision, some lean towards a form of Black nationalism. In other words, having somewhat of a separate Black nation state. And some of us saw a, a sort of an integrated state, without a separate kind of Black entity. So there was somewhat a little tension there. So in the Black movement, there were different strategies and different visions. So for one time, for instance, many Black nationalists were saying, well, you know, the United States should be divided into about, and Blacks should have about 5 states, and then and there should be kind of a geographical region where Black folks could establish an independent state in North America. I think that was a minority opinion because for most folks, it struck them as being unrealistic, right? Number one. And the white US government is not going to let set aside 5 states and pull them out of the union so Blacks could have their independent state. That was never going to happen. So I didn't believe in that strategy or that vision. So most of us were internationalists, and we had a vision of a multicultural society, you know, free of racism and capitalism, and that was pretty much the orientation. And so right now, but we had a Black organization because we thought that Blacks, number one, Blacks were the most progressive population in the United States, and that many of the integrated kind of organizations get sort of sidetracked, and Black organizations, when they were all Black, tended to be more militant and put racism on the top of the agenda. Many of the white organizations, progressive ones, and others tend to put race pretty much on the back burner, right? And so many of Black radicals say, hey, we're going to put racism on the front burner, and we're not going to have these internal debates with white progressives because they want to kind of relegate the racism to a sort of subordinate position on the agenda, right? And so we had this vision, this idea that we were going to build a Black Liberation Party, and we're going to organize the Black community and primarily focus on organizing Black folks. And once the Black political vehicle will be at the forefront, and behind the Black political vehicle will be whites and Asians and all that. So, and then we saw the blending or an integration of the forces as we progress. But since we thought that the Blacks were the most progressive, that they should provide the leadership. And that was the rationale. But how does that differ in 2022? Well, I think that you have to start off national. The population has drastically changed. In 1964, the brown population and the Asian population, all those populations were very, very small. And there was not too much activity in those communities, not to the extent that it was in the Black community. And the real dynamic was a Black and white dynamic. But now, the brown population is larger than the Black population. Cities like Chicago, there are more Latinx folks than in Chicago. So the changing in demographics has changed. The mindset of many of the young folks have changed. So the approach of building just a Black political vehicle, to me, is not the most progressive way to approach. And I think you approach through that all these groups can have their own independent identity structures. And I think that's good. They need that, so you need sort of independent.
Mom, the recording, it's going to catch you moving the mouse. So are you moving the mouse around? Okay. So we can just maybe cut that part out. It's just distracting me.
Sorry.
A little bit.
Although I was going to take down the photograph, but before that, I was wondering if Luke could just identify the people holding the flag, or at least those that.
Okay. Okay. Well, let me go back and identify the holders of the flag. On your left, I'm at the end holding the flag. next to me, right, going towards the right, is General Baker. The next person, and he's from Detroit. We're both members of Uhuru. The person in the middle is from Massachusetts, Bob Collier, right? He was the one that was entrapped by the detectives and CIA on a so-called plot to blow up the Statue of Liberty, right? Next to him is Charles Simmons. He's a member of Uhuru, right? Member of our group. And at the end is, I can't recall his name. He was a photographer from California, Los Angeles. And I can't recall his name at the time, at this moment. And behind him, the guy with the glasses, kind of light-skinned guy, that's Ernie M. Kawamoto. And he's also from California. His name, Ernie Allen is his birth name. So the 6 people in the front, you know, and then on the second row, right behind the member holding the flag with the glasses, guy with the glasses at the far right is Ernie Allen. So that's 6 of us. There were about 5 other Black folks on the trip. Because my very dear friend Charles Johnson is not in the photo, right? And he was a member of Uhuru, because there are 4 of us.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the screen so it's just us. Over to you.
Okay, again, as you were saying, well, how is it different now? The demographics are different, and the period that we are in the 60s, that was a really dynamic period where you had a very strong student movement, a movement against anti-war movement. You had the energized women's movement, and you had there was a lot of turbulence and progressive turbulence around the world, especially in Detroit, in Michigan. So right now, the politics, the rise of fascism, you know, we had Trumpism, you have a very right-wing neo-colonial, capitalism is much more dominant, and there's a much more conservative vibe in the country. So and the society has been highly militarized. For instance, in the 60s, police wore uniforms. They didn't have helmets, right? And so they would be like a person dressed in a uniform for a ceremony. But the police now, they're dressed like they're in a combat, like they going in and fight a war. They got heavy weapons and all their squad cars. So it's more, the society is more militarized, and it's much more dangerous in terms of its direction. So in '64, the country was going in a progressive way. They're opening up universities for Black folks. '64, they're getting ready to pass the Civil Rights Act. In '65, the Voting Rights Act. So we're moving forward, and all these progressive forces pushing. But now the progressive forces are being backed up. What you see is basically they're pushing back even against voting rights, trying to, and they say, well, you know, the conservatives may have smaller numbers, but they have more control because they're making strategic moves to dominate the organs of the government, the states, right? So they say, well, they said that it's more anti-democratic in this sense, that we don't need the majority of the folks. And what we do in terms of the electorate, we try to take as many people of color especially, out of the electorate. How are we going to do that? We don't even want them to participate and make choices or anything like folks. All right. So here's how we're going to do it. We are going to criminalize as many Black and brown bodies as we can. and then we're going to put them in prisons. And if, in other words, we're going to make them felons. And then we're going to pass laws that felons, when they get out, they cannot vote, right? So you already shrunk the participants. Now, the next move is that we're going to gerrymander regions. For those Blacks who can vote, we're going to put them in districts or in voting districts to reduce their voting effects. Right? So you're going to cut it up in a way to minimize their the effects of their votes. And now our next move is that for certification of votes and all that, we're going to put conservative whites in positions of, for instance, state attorney general that has to do the certification. So they go into all these mechanisms to reduce the vote. So at the same time that you have an increasing proportion of the population are people of color, well, it's not going to translate into increasing number of political power for people of color. We're going to be involved in all of this manipulation to minimize their political voices. So that's what you're saying. See, in 64, it's going on just the opposite. We're pushing for voting rights and winning those rights and beginning to elect more Black officials as Congress people and mayors and all of that. See, in 64, there was hardly any of that. So although you have almost 50 Black members in Congress out of 450, which it looks good, but then all of the political machinations are going on to reduce their effect, right? So we're in a different period. It's very different from, in a way. I mean, it's the same that you have the same ruling elite, wealthy white corporate America. Wall Street runs America. You ran in 64, is running in 22. But the way they're going to maintain their power and the moves they're going to make is somewhat different. So right now, progressive forces are being backed up. I mean, the right wing is making a lot of gains at the expense of the West. So you saw the rollback, maybe just in terms of the abortion, right? I mean, women were winning abortion rights and all in 72, but now they rolling that back, okay? And then, of course, things like welfare support and all that was much greater in the 60s as a result of those struggles. They're cutting all that stuff back, okay? So there's been there's a lot of different, so your political strategies and the vehicles you use have to be adopted and adjusted to the changed political environment.
So getting back to Cuba, because I find that you're definitely like a storytelling person. Were there particular personal narratives or maybe theories or books that you found yourself sharing with individuals there that that maybe they took away a lot of meaning from?
Actually, I can't read Spanish. I didn't take any books with me on the trip.
Yeah, I guess one thing that General Baker had mentioned in his interview is that he was sharing the stories of like black people in Detroit, and that he said that people were like crying and very emotional about, I guess, the realities of what you were experiencing.
Mhm.
Was that your experience as well, or not at all?
Well, I remember this when particularly some of the white students were talking about America. Sometimes I would intervene and say, wait a minute, you're not telling the whole story, and begin to talk about maybe that story from a Black perspective. Because what they would do is some of the progressive whites, they were talking about capitalism, how the working class is oppressed, and all those other kinds of things. They wouldn't hardly ever mention the race dimension of the oppression. All right. So wait, man, missing a big part of here, and because the class of the working class was divided. You had the Black working class, white working class, and basically the white workers were generally, we will label them as basically the privileged white working class as in relation to the black working class, right? And the white working class in America was the most privileged at all, because the working class, say in Germany and Japan, well, the war ended in 1945, and here we are in 64, almost a decade later, and they're still recovering. The standard of living is still is not on par with the U.S. So the U.S. was the king of the hill, undoubtedly the most powerful country in what, I mean, it was, so it was the preeminent power on the globe. And so their whole idea with his other American allies is to remake the globe. They say they're going to basically make the political and economic arrangements for the whole planet. And they have much of the power to do it. And that's why but their plan was resisted by the Vietnamese, by the Africans, trying to break from colonialism and that. So they had a global plan to continue their global domination. It's just like the European powers got together in 1984 to divide up Africa, right? They're going to say, this is going to be the world order. Here's the African order. Okay, Britain, you guys got that. You French, you got this. Portugal, you have that. Germany, you get this part. And they just sliced up Africa among themselves. After the Second World War, the US and all, they say, here's how we're going to slice up. And then they try to help France retain its former colonies, because Vietnam was a former French colony. And so the Vietnamese liberation fronts defeated the French. And then the US was coming in and stepping in, okay, pass it. And the US tried to kind of impose their rule on the Vietnamese, but the Vietnamese said, we're not having any of that. And so the fight continued. So the Vietnamese had defeated the French. And then later they defeated the US. As I said before, when I saw the body language and the eyes of the Vietnamese, they still had that spirit. The only way that you're going to get in here is that you're going to have to kill all of us, right? So if you come in there and I have this fight, we're going to win. So if we don't
what did winning look like for you at that time?
You mean for the Black Liberation Front in America? What did it win?
Yeah, like in 1964, because you're saying you're fighting for the, like what did that utopian space look like
for my vision,
you?
Okay, for me, is that I would see that America would be a socialist a socialist country. All the major industries and things will be under people's control through the government, that the masses and basically the working class people will run the country. And that all of the racial barriers will be brought down. And so you would have people were free to associate or socialize without harassment, without stigma, and all that. So it's like when we were in Cuba, all right? If you go to an eating place and all of that, like for instance, like I'll give you an example. On many schools and college campuses, you go to the cafeteria, you can see a racial pattern. Clusters of blacks over here, whites over here, and then members of different groups scattered about. So it's not like everybody's with the blacks, everybody's with the Asians, everybody. But you do see clusterings, right? So in those the norms and the vibes that you get, and say, well, what's a comfortable space? When you're in Cuba, you have Cubas of different colors and whatever, but you didn't see that color clustering, right? That was not that kind of dynamic. Now, Cuba was like the Mississippi of the Caribbean. I mean, you know, you had the U.S. up there, and you had those racism, but that racism in Cuba was much different from how it operated in America, and you can really tell the difference in terms of that. So the point here is that, yeah, there were racism in Cuba, and you had these white Cubans who ran Cuba, and they're collaborating partners with the white Americans, right? And then you had, and Cuba is highly mixed, you know, so you have a real kind of a continuum there. And so they didn't have the rigid hard lines that you found in the US, right? So it was there, you know, people know who the elite were, but you didn't have highly color coded areas or the way people related to each other. And then also in 1964, one thing I noticed is that they were address each other as comrade, and there was a lot of physical embracing. How Cubans would meet each other, they would hug each other, right? You know, and so they had this kind of close touching kind of thing, right? They go up there and they hug and all this sort of thing, and they had a kind of free flow stuff going on. It's not like, you know, kind of stiff stuff as compared with the U.S. You know, you have, but they were kind of hugging and embracing and loose in terms of.
So you saw that between people within the same gender identity, so like men hugging men and women hugging women, and also maybe
was
gender
more,
gender non-conforming individuals as well.
right, but it
So
was
overall,
more,
like a cultural of
mhm,
physical touch.
but it was more common among the women. Okay.
Did you see men doing that as well, like hugging and embracing, or like holding hands or anything like that?
No, I didn't see no men holding hands. No.
Okay, but they would hug each other when they
Yeah, right.
greeted.
They embrace,
And that
right.
wasn't something that you practiced with like the 6 people that you came with. Did you have like um a male relationship where you could have like friendship touching where you're hugging, or I don't know.
No, no. My generation was uh heavy duty masculinity, you know. So there
So a
wasn't
lot
much.
of traditional masculinity,
That's right. Yeah,
performative.
we talking about the 50s,
Mhm.
60s. I mean, it was heavy duty macho kind of
Yeah,
thing,
it
right?
doesn't mean that maybe that's not something you
I'm
were
just saying, right.
practicing, but so that was something that you also
Right,
fed
right,
into that cultural
right,
practice and you
right.
didn't divert from that.
So I mean, the hugging is just, I mean, it was a masculine kind of hug. It's just like athletes, you know, hey man, you know,
A
blah blah blah,
pat
and all
pat.
that. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Okay, so
So
not a
they
lot of
hug
affectionate
right
love.
on and all that. So
Mhm.
there were places, but you know, men walk, men walking down the street holding hands, that was a no for sure. Okay.
Yeah, so a lot of homophobia during that
Yeah.
time where
Oh
men
yes.
couldn't. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
hmm Um, when you were in Cuba, since you weren't always traveling within the large group, because that's a massive amount of people, were you ever profiled differently than as like a Black African American man? Were you ever perceived, because there's a large like Afro-Cuban population,
Mhm.
which sometimes happens when people travel. Were any of the like 6 of you profiled as different ethnicities? Or yeah, was that an experience that you had? Or did they say like, oh, that's an American when they saw you?
Uh, none that I recall. I mean, if you know, like Charles and I used to jog, right, and all that, put on a little jogging and all that. So, you know, I guess unless they spoke to us, you know, maybe they thought we were Cuban or something, you know. So it's not like we were really standing out, you know, because there's a lot of
And when you say
Cuban.
you weren't really standing out, can you describe what that means?
What that meant was over in Cuba, they had a lot of African students and folks. So they were very accustomed to seeing folks with our physical characteristics. All right. So we didn't stand out that way. You know, I mean, most of the, as you say, most of the students uh, look like, you know, like average Puerto Ricans, light skin, you know, curly hair and all that. And people my color are a minority, right, and all that. So the typical Cuban looks Latino olive complexion, you know, and all that. But there are a large number, and then there's so many, and you have the spectrum, a gradation, right? And at this point, I think maybe the majority of Cubans have some African ancestry, right? Because of the highly mixed population. So I don't think they have typical Cuban did not pay too much attention to who we were. Yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of maybe a US narrative that in Cuba that just wasn't an experience for you. Was there any place in Cuba that you wanted to see or visit that you all went to, like any historical sites or like if you went into the libraries to look at archives? I'm not sure. But were there any like physical spaces in particular that you wanted to go on the island and
For me,
explore?
all right. For me, there was nothing in particular. You know, they had itinerary, and you know, I generally just followed the itinerary because my deep knowledge about the geography of Cuba and their monuments and their history was limited. You know, what attracted to me to Cuba was their revolution, who the revolutionary fighters were, and those kind of stories, right? But the other things that you'd be interested in a travelogue kind of a way, okay, here's this, but
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if like if there were artists or like historical sites, or if there were like maybe if you wanted to, because you ended up teaching in a university, and education seems to be a large part of your philosophy, because you ended up, you know, being a college professor after or not straight after this experience, but that's kind of how you professionally grew. So just wondering if you had any experience going to the universities there.
Yes, we did go to the university, and that was one of my favorite sites.
Okay,
But
can you tell us more about why it was your favorite?
okay, I'll tell you why it's my favorite. But for the first thing, I think that you might be assuming something that's not true.
I'm
The
not assuming.
assumption.
I'm just
Oh, wait,
asking.
I'm going to tell you what it is. You mentioned as a university professor, perhaps I had an interest in all that. In 1964, Azenia, I had not even graduated from college. In 1964, I was a math science student. I had no intentions or desires or vision to become a university professor. Yeah. So that was not even in the cards. All right. So I didn't see myself, you know, I better get this knowledge because I want to teach it in university and all, because I wasn't pursuing a career in higher education and a professor. So I was just making that clear, right?
Yeah, I guess I was wondering if it like sparked your interest, because again, I guess I feel like a lot of your philosophies is really embedded in a structured form of traditional education. So, and I guess that's what your life led you up to, is being an academic lecturer in higher ed. So I wasn't assuming that you had thoughts of being a professor at that time, but I knew that your philosophies aligned with that. And you talk a lot about your experience in school. So just wondering if you ever was like, oh, I wonder what Cuban schools would look like, and what does that look like? You know, you're a university student, so like, what does the universities look like there? Because we went to South Africa and we had the opportunity to go to primary schools and into higher ed settings, and that was very, at least for me culturally, it was different and very fruitful, and being able to contrast. And I think kind of, you know, it maybe, you know, did it end up feeding into what you ended up becoming, of like when you were like, oh, this is an opportunity to get my PhD. Oh, you know, Cuba, you know, kind of a part of it, maybe could be a small part, kind of fueled that journey. So I guess that's more of what I'm trying to ask.
Right. Okay. Number one, as you were saying, I already had a great curiosity. And I had, you know, even in high school, I started to recognize Kool-Aid. I mean, people telling false stories, you know, things that didn't jive with reality. I mean, I'm reading something in the book and I'm observing.
There's Kool-Aid in the water.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I mean, so going for the okie-doke, going for the propaganda. So I began to really notice propaganda very early. I was always very curious. I was always, I wanted to know how things work. You know, that's why I was in science and all that. I say, you know, I'm curious about, and I always had a huge appetite for knowledge, acquiring to knowledge, and trying to learn firsthand as much as I could. So I had the curiosity. I didn't have a lot of large knowledge base about Cuba itself, but I was interested in terms of how their society works. You know, how do they do education? How do they do healthcare? What does it mean to be socialist in Cuba? You know, because each country has their own character and their own culture, and then you have different kind of principles about how do you create an economic system that distributes services and resources in a way that it meets all of the people's needs, and it operates on basically on a needs base rather than on a profit base. You know, we'll produce it if people, if you, and you'll get it if you can pay for it, right? That's what we have in our society. And then their society is that you'll get it if you need it. And we're going to address all needs first, right? And go beyond that. So that, and so that kind of values kind of established the ethos of that society of Cuba, as opposed to the ethos of America. The ethos of America is that it's driven is by greed, by profit, and so it has no problems with kicking people to the curb if they don't have the means to do better, right? When they give up, say, we're gonna be a needs-based society, and we're gonna develop our whole population. And what I need, and we need a highly educated population to be able to function at a higher level and raise everybody's standard of living. We can't do it with an illiterate population, undeveloped kind of a system. So we have to build basically from a firm foundation.
So what did the universities look like in Cuba when you visited them?
But
And why was it one of your favorite? Because you kind of lit up a little bit.
Okay, well, they had large lecture halls. In '64, they didn't have the kind of technical tools that you found in American universities.
So at Wayne State, that wasn't, you weren't attending classes with large lecture halls
Yes,
at
we
that
did.
time. You did.
Yes, we did. But we had
Sorry,
small,
what are you saying then?
higher education in the world. The United States had the most advanced colleges and universities in the world. That was their strong suit. And then that's why many in the 60s and 70s, a huge number of students from Asia, from Europe, would come to American universities. You know, I mean, Harvard was at the top of the university structure on the planet. Okay, so it set the standards and the models, and all those other countries were so the University of Havana could not compare with the universities of America in terms of their resources and how they were organized, right? In terms of the curriculum, they were comparable because America was just teaching a lot of propaganda, you know, aside from science and technology. You got into social sciences. And the Cuban University was probably one of the most advanced in Latin America, right? So they just started at the bottom. I mean, even compared to the universities in Brazil and
So in the
Chile.
Caribbean, you think?
Yeah, right. I mean, Cuba could hold its own. And I mean, this is like a little digression, but you know, during the 50s and 60s, Cuba, in terms of the Olympics, had more gold medals than any country in South America. They took on more medals. In other words, they believe in excellence. We're going to have top rate athletes. We're going to have top rate artists because they're ballerinas and ballet, and their arts was at the top. And so they strive, you know, like to be excellent in those fields. um, yeah, despite their dearth of resources, right? And they make the best. So the university, I saw were classrooms and all. They weren't classrooms themselves weren't not impressive because the U.S. has imposed a ban in 1962. They tried to cripple the Cuban economy, and they tried to cut off the U.S. tried to deliberately tried to impoverish Cuba. Right? They want to strangle Cuba, but the Soviet Union, particularly, and then the Chinese, they had trade with them, and they were able to prop up a lot of their industries. But it was a real struggle, and it's now the U.S. right now is clamping down hard on them, and they've been clamping down hard since the U.S. defeated their little puppets, Cuban puppets that they armed for an armed rebellion that failed, right? So yeah, and as I mentioned before, in terms of their higher education, they said that we're going to be really super strong in healthcare and in medicine, and they pulled most of their resources to develop the most advanced medical schools in Latin America. So you saw Cubans going to Africa. There were some Cubans going to offer to go to Louisiana during the Katrina, right? And then every time there's hurricanes and all that, very few deaths in Cuba because they know how to mobilize. You know, they have their society organized on neighborhood levels. They know who's in charge. You know, they're very well organized, right? And that's why they don't suffer as much as those other islands during hurricanes and any other kind of disruptions because of their level of organization.
We have about 10 minutes more. So just letting you know.
Anything you want to share?
Well, one of they had the Cubans after the revolution took over these 5-star hotels, right? And that's I say that they put us up in those five-star hotels. I mean, wow. And their cuisines were tops. Some of the best food I've ever had in my life was in Cuba, right? And so they had the beaches and all that. So I mean, it was like we had a kind of a luxury vacation. They treated us as though we were kind of celebrities or ambassadors, right? So I guess we were like ambassadors for the Cuban Revolution, the truth telling in terms of
Have you had a lived experience like that before then? Like someone I guess like celebrating you and kind of honoring you based upon like what you've accomplished so far in your life? Like had you experienced that appreciation for yourself before?
um, in terms of society or government.
Yeah, society.
You know,
Like was there any point of like Detroit and maybe in your um the community that you lived in? Was there anything that resembled that in any kind of likeness?
well, you have good feelings when you're around your family and around the neighbors, because when we grew up, for instance, like in Eastern Michigan, it was kind of tight community. I mean, everybody kind of knew everybody, and people were supportive. I know that if a family lost a member, people would go and take care of the kids and make sure they fed, because anyway, so it was a strong sense of community there, in Inkster. And these folks were, like my parents were Southern. These are old, friendly Southern kind of folk, right? And folk that talked to each other, and looked out for each other, right? It's not like everything was hunky dory, but you know you're pretty much in a safe community, right? Because it was a strong community.
Were like Charles Johnson, General Baker, Charles Simmons, Robert Williams, were they a part of that with you? Were they like coming from the same neighborhood or?
Well, General Baker grew up, you know, around Detroit, so did Charles Simmons, and yes, we all had close, you know, like knit kind of communications. You know, we were
Mhm.
kind of a family oriented people, just like Charles Simmons or General Baker's. They knew who their cousins were. They knew who their parents were. You
Mhm.
know, I mean, it was very few single parent families, broken, what we would consider dysfunctional or broken families. That was rare. You
Mhm.
know, most folks had, you know, intact families that were poor and struggling, but you know, the parents, you know, took on the responsibility of being parents, and those parents will also check other little kids that were getting out of line. Yeah,
Mhm.
and all the parents had some kind of unwritten rule, you know, about uh, all these kids are our kids to a certain extent. When they get out of line, hey, we're gonna check them. Okay.
Was that cultural practices? Was there anything similar like that that you noticed or was spoken about from the um, from people in Cuba that you were having conversations with?
Well, in Cuba, because these folks were, a lot of them have, they're poor people,
Mhm.
and they, and they almost, they knew each other, and they were, you can tell that they lived in a community, right?
How do
That,
you tell when someone lives in a community? What does that mean?
well, how they greet each other, how they acknowledge each other.
So the
Because,
touchings, you
you're
saw
right. I
that
mean,
happening a lot.
right, right.
Mhm.
Because you live in apartments and all in America. Sometimes you don't know who the other apartment dwellers are, right? You may know some of them and all that, but there, it's like you know, they're familiar with each other. It's high, you know, that sort of thing, right? And it's like sometimes they describe, you know, these some of these black students who went to you know, like historically black institution. They used to there, everybody's kind of nod and acknowledge each other's presence and all that sort of thing, right? Then they say they come to Minnesota, man, everybody, you know, there's no kind of greetings, no kind of acknowledgement, no kind of eye contact, you know, people's got their, you know, going on about their business. So you didn't have this kind of atmosphere where, you know, yeah, you know, hey, what's happening? You know, we're then, you know, there's some kind of greeting exchange, or you just throw your head up, something like that, you know, keep on going. But in here, you know, it's like, you know, they minimize kind of contact, eye contact or something like that. You go about your business, right?
Mhm.
So in
So that's
Cuba,
like kind of the contrast that you were seeing
yeah,
from.
but in Cuba, you know, you have
Mhm.
that kind of spirit. You know, people kind of loose, you know, they acknowledge you and, you know, going about that. So it's just like, you know, like in Inkster, in a small uh, all black community, people acknowledge you and they, hey, Mr. Smith, what's happening? You know, hey, there, Johnny, and all that. So they come on over. You know, it's very informal, right? I mean, but they was very strict, like in the black community, about how you address adults. You never call them by their first name. You know, it's always Mr. Jones or Mr. Smith, you know, something like that. So they had very kind of a code of conduct, you know, in terms of what, you know, the behavior. And then a lot of kids were, you know, some were cuss, but they know when you're around adults, you know, that's not the language you use. You got to be respectful. You know, do that around your peer group, but not around that. So it's the do's and don'ts, you know, the space that you, how you function in this space, and you got to function differently in that space. And
Mhm.
right now, you know, you can see in a lot of, when things break down, you know, people using profanity all over the place for no good reason. Telling her that, I mean, that's a breakdown of social order. And then
Well,
quite a lot of disrespect.
yeah,
Okay,
it
that's
seems
the
like
way,
you and
that's for my generation. That's the way we,
General Baker definitely communicate very differently because I don't know if you've
right?
listened to his
I
interview.
listen, he was cussing like,
Yeah,
he was
I mean,
cussing left and
so
right, right.
but people can hold as much
Right,
intelligence
right,
and as much
right,
expression,
right,
but it shows a
right.
very different
Okay,
personality of how you both held yourselves,
okay.
even though very
But
respected men. I identify,
okay,
but I guess I don't see it as
okay.
as a barrier, but I think that's just the cultural generation that
Uh,
we're also coming from. So
yeah.
I mean, he also came from your generation, but he also did swear
No,
quite
you
quite
can look at
a lot.
other General Baker's videos and when he's being interviewed in the language he used. When he was using his, the language of guys. You can see that was kind of relaxed, and he's talking, and he's like talking with guys, factory kind of guys, and that's how they talk. So he has a lot of videos, and when he's doing a video, he used different kind of language. In that one, he was like, "Hey, I'm just talking with the dudes, and I'm gonna use that language, and I'm comfortable with it."
Yeah, I guess I'm
It's
not
a
trying to
setting.
minimize his.
So I'm just saying, in different
I know
audience.
that everybody can code switch and it
Okay,
matters
well,
in
he
the
was supposed to.
audience.
So he just using,
I've never
language.
heard you talk out of like to swear before. So I don't see I guess for me, I don't see you code switching. I see you being very consistently professor. So at least hearing from General Baker and what you've just shared, it seems like he chose to express himself in the different identities that he functioned in. And I guess I don't really I don't
Yeah.
know those parts of you, if those exist or not. I don't
Yeah.
know.
All right. Well,
But yeah.
yeah, because I'm not comfortable using that language. That language was not allowed in the
I
household.
mean, it's not simplicity on like
I'm just
just
saying.
swearing,
Yeah.
but yeah.
I mean,
Mhm.
when he was talking like that, and I hear people talking, it doesn't bother me. It's because I mean, they usually, most people are kind of very. Uh, it depends on the kind of situation they're in, but for but for me, I said that I don't that kind of language. Uh, I think that language is only is appropriate to express some genuine emotions. I mean, I mean, if you stomp your foot and say, "Oh," I mean, it just comes out, okay. And then once the curse words just come out, and there's no control over them, and the situation warrants the profanity. Somebody said, they use MFs and blah, blah, blah. And then you look at the situation, it just comes out. So it's natural. But when you just use it, and that's the way you can't, your vocabulary is so limited that all you can use that profanity. That's a limitation. But if it comes out and you express an emotion, it just jumps out, then it's appropriate. Right.
Mhm.
So
When did you okay. Well, I feel like we're done now. We don't I
yeah.
mean, this isn't really fit the thing.
Mhm.
I mean, kind of, but
Okay.
I think
Well,
we're done.
okay. So we'll schedule another one. All right. So